Take a closer look at what tariffs are in place already. Mexico and Canada have already been hit with 25% tariffs, with some temporary exemptions in place since the start of March. A 10% tariff remains on Canadian energy. A 20% tariff is in place on all Chinese imports. Steel and aluminum from all countries face 25% tariffs. Any country buying oil or gas from Venezuela will pay a 25% tariff on its trade with the U.S., and all car and car part imports will also be taxed with 25%. Any tariffs for the European Union just yet. He has threatened a 25% tariff on goods with up to 200% tariffs on wine and alcoholic products. Economist Trinh Nguyen told us earlier what she expects from the new tariffs.
Well, I think they're going to probably be staggered in different levels, likely somewhere between 25, 10, and 0. It remains very difficult to see how he's going to do it, given the fact that many people think if the level is too high, maybe it's going to be temporary. If the level is relatively low, it means that some sectoral tariffs are very much likely. Either way, tariffs are here. I think it's going to have a pretty negative impact on the U.S. in the short term. The front loading is impacting Q1 GDP, likely Q2 GDP. The Asian exporters are benefiting from the front loading, and so as well as the European exporters. And the big uncertainty, I think, regarding Liberation Day is that it's not going to feel like liberation at all, because the levels that he set are supposedly negotiation starting points, which means that we don't really know what it's going to look like. And that uncertainty is going to drag on not just U.S. growth, consumption, investment, but also the ability of other countries to deploy CapEx as well. So in other words, it's going to have a global reverberation, and any clarity would be much better than not, and I don't think we're going to get that on Liberation
He said
Day.
there will be levies on all countries. Do you really believe there will be no exemptions?
Well, I think that in the short term, it will be extremely devastating for the U.S. if there are levies on all countries, because the U.S. Imports about 4.1 trillion of goods. And so there's no way to substitute. And the impact is going to be that prices will go higher, impacting not just consumption, but also the investment. And that means that you're going to have demand destruction. So yes, he can get around to this balancing the trade balance, but to do that, he's going to destroy demand in the U.S. I don't think that's going to happen. I do think that he's basically front-loading a lot of bad news, given the fact that 2026 and midterm elections. So he believes that he wants to move very fast with many things, and he doesn't have time, so he wants to front-load a lot of it to exact negotiation and concessions from countries. And the issue here is that in order to do that, he has to make sure people know what his demands are, right? So, for example, on the reciprocal tariffs, it is tariffs differentials, then it's easy. Countries can just lower tariffs. Vietnam has already done that, and some countries have signaled that they will highlight that. If it's an imbalance, they can promise to buy more, and so on and so forth. But if the demands are not very clear, then it's very hard. If you set a benchmark, for example, with the relationship with China at fentanyl as a benchmark, then it's very difficult for China to address that issue, right? So on reciprocal, I think what people will look out for is not just the level of tariffs, but the criteria in which they set for the tariff level. Obviously it can be a blanket tariff, but if it's a more targeted tariff, then how they can get around to that. And that, I think, will give more certainty for markets if demands are very clear. The criteria to set the rate of reciprocal are very clear, because that means that there are ways in which they can go about mitigating that to make it seem more fair, so to speak, according to the
many question marks at this point. But you focus on emerging Asian economies. How are they likely to be affected by what looks like an escalating global trade war?
So far, it's actually U.S. allies that have been most affected. So, for example, the auto tariffs impact South Korea and Japan the most. These are key U.S. allies. The steel removal exemptions, of course, impacts the allies as well, because they got the removal of quotas. So far, it's China and then these allies. So tomorrow, the likes of Thailand is very, very nervous, and so is India, because it has, at the headline tariff level, it has a big differential. But Vietnam is nervous, even though it doesn't have a big differential. It has a big trade imbalance with the U.S. and export as a share of GDP is very, very high. So the short-term focus is to mitigate the downside risks to growth. because fundamentally the U.S. is still a biggest demander of goods globally, and export to the U.S. is very, very important. So everyone is going to pay attention tomorrow, not just the headline level, but what criteria the administration is going to set as the, whether or not it's country-based, is it sectoral-based, and so on and so forth, so that what they can do to mitigate. We don't think that, unlike the EU and Canada and China, the rest of the Asian countries have not used retaliation yet. But that's an area that people can look at as well. But so far, they have laid low. Hopefully, this too shall pass, and then somehow they can get some kind of exemptions and concessions and see how it goes. So I think it's more of a cautious wait and see mode. Meanwhile, we're going to try to diversify export markets, but that's very difficult to do immediately in the short term. The rest of the Asian markets, and very similar to the EU, is that you try to lay low, avoid tariffs, how to address the tariff if they were to be imposed. Secondly, diversify export markets through liberalization and finding partners. So if you look at Southeast Asia, a lot of countries are signing a lot of trade agreements with countries that you wouldn't even think of, namely because we need to look wherever we can. And it's very difficult to replace the U.S. as a consumer of last resort for global demand because it is the biggest importer of goods globally.
That was economist Trinh Nguyen. Thank you so much, Trinh.